Chapter 8, Filtering Tests. In Chapter 7, we learned how to provide command options and config files for PyTest. In this chapter, we will take commands even further by learning how to filter test cases when we run them. Running all tests in a suite is alright when the suite is small, like the one that we have built together so far. However, in the real world, test suites can be very large. Suites with hundreds, thousands, and even tens of thousands of test cases are not uncommon for large projects. Running all tests in the suite isn't always practical, especially when trying to pinpoint or recreate failures. Thankfully, PyTest offers easy test filtering. The PyTest command can take arguments for paths to search for tests. When no path arguments are provided, as we have run up to this point, PyTest will use the current directory. However, if paths are provided, PyTest will search exclusively within the given paths. For example, if we use the tests directory, then PyTest will still run all our tests because they all exist under the tests directory. However, if we use the stuff directory, then PyTest won't run any tests because it can't find it. PyTest can take paths to directories or modules. For example, if we wanted to run only the accumulator tests, then we could supply the path tests/tests_accum.py. Notice how the math tests are excluded. We could also provide multiple paths as arguments, and PyTest will search everything provided. PyTest can also run individual test case functions. To do this, supply the path to the module, followed by ;, and then followed by the test case function. For example, tests/testmath.py : test1 plus 1. Again, you can spell out any number of individual tests this way. However, running individual tests adds lots of letters to the command line. I recommend running individual tests only as necessary, and preferably one at a time. Sometimes you may know a test name or part of a test name, but you might not know its full module path, or you may want to run all tests that contain a certain token. To filter tests by such expressions, use the -k option. For example, -k1 will run all test functions that contain the substring 1. Notice that it runs tests from both test modules. -k can handle more than substrings too. It supports Boolean logic with and, or, and not keywords. For example, 1 and not accum will run tests only from the test_math module that contains token 1. Using -k expressions is very useful for running similar tests across separate modules. However, naming conventions are not always consistent, and -k may be susceptible to false positives. Thankfully, PyTest provides one more way to filter tests: markers. Markers are basically tags for test cases. Any test can have any number of markers. PyTest has a few standard markers, but you can add your own custom markers too. In fact, we've already used markers. PyTest mark parameterize is a standard marker. To add a marker to a test case function, add a PyTest mark decorator. Then add a suffix with a name for the marker. For example, let's add PyTest mark math to each of the math tests. And let's add PyTest mark accumulator to each of the accumulator tests. Whenever we add custom markers to PyTest, we should also add them to the PyTest configuration file. Otherwise, PyTest will print warning messages. Make sure to open PyTest ini and add the 2 new markers. Let's run the tests using our markers. Use the -m option and specify the desired marker name. When the tests run, you'll see that only the tests containing the given marker are executed. Nice. You can also use and, or, and not Boolean expressions with -m, just like you could with -k expressions. Here are some of PyTest's standard markers. Skip will skip the test case. Skip if will skip the test case based on a given condition. For example, tests may not be applicable for certain operating systems or Python versions. Xfail will report an expected failure if the test case fails. This helps avoid report pollution for known problems. And we already know about parameterize from a previous chapter. There's one more thing I'd like to cover regarding test case filtering. By default, PyTest will search for test cases either from the current directory or from the paths and options given at the command line. However, setting test paths in the configuration file will explicitly set test case searches. For example, we can set test paths equal tests in our PyTest INI file to make sure PyTest searches only the test folder. Setting paths is a great way to enforce structure and also speed up discovery time for large projects. As you can see, PyTest provides great support for filtering and marking test cases. Use it to your advantage.